morning, everybody. Happy hump day and welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's deputy news editor, Sophie Bateman. Morning, Sophie.
Morning. How's it going?
Fine. Live from a sunny tower in
the sunny sights of Canary Wharf.
It looks amazing in that cloud. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, everybody. So get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to ask yourselves what you have to do to get locked up in America. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the Princess of Wales' visit to the Royal Marsden Cancer Treatment Centre yesterday, on the same day that she announced she was in remission from the disease. The Princess met other patients going through treatment and praised staff in the clinic where she had her own chemotherapy. There's more on that in the paper. We'll discuss a bit of it later as well. It's quite inspiring stuff. I recommend you search it out and read it if you can. Now, elsewhere, though, people are not being so inspiring. And on page 8 is the extraordinary story of how Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Tulip Siddiq, resigned from her ministerial job after the government's ethics advisor found she'd done nothing wrong. Sophie, can you explain this to us? If she's innocent, why has she resigned?
I mean, as always, this seems to be more of a question of optics. Does this look good for the Labour Party? Tulip Siddiq is the Treasury Minister in charge of the UK's anti-corruption policy. And she was recently named. It's not ideal. So she was recently named by an anti-corruption commission in Bangladesh as having been involved in fraudulently obtaining plots of land. And that is alongside allegations made against her aunt, who is the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who actually fled the country last year after weeks of violent protests. She's been at the center of corruption allegations for a long time. Tulip Siddiq had also previously been named in some court documents about embezzlement from a nuclear power project. Those were filed by a political rival of her aunt, so it is difficult for us in this country to sort of know how much weight to give those allegations. But overall, it's just a bit of a mess. Tulip Siddiq has enjoyed kind of the full-throated support from Keir Starmer up until yesterday when she did announce her resignation. But she was given a pretty kind of glowing kind of message from Keir, who's obviously known her for a long time. They're both MPs in North London. And it's interesting to contrast this to Louise Haigh, who was the transport MP who left Parliament last year over a kind of what would seem in relation to, corruption and embezzlement allegations, a relatively minor offence of misreporting a stolen phone. So it's interesting that Tulip Siddiq has kind of been given the full support of Keir Starmer and the rest of the Labour Party, whereas Louise Haigh kind of didn't get the same treatment. And some Tories are sort of pointing out an interesting discrepancy in how those two were treated.
Yeah, the exchange of letters afterwards is always quite telling in what the Prime Minister really thinks. And Tulip got a very nice warm send-off and a very explicit suggestion that she would return to government at some point in the future, whereas Louise Haigh was dropped with about 3 lines of disgust.
Yes.
For something that she had pleaded guilty to and done her penalty for. And
exactly. It happened about a decade earlier or something, hadn't it?
Many years earlier. So this is what's actually happened in this ethics investigation. Okay, so Tulip Siddiq, her aunt was leader of Bangladesh, and her family were linked to sort of the formation of that country. Now, her aunt was accused very recently, and over time actually, of being a bit of a despot and a tyrant. I think today in other papers there are allegations that protesters were beaten, human rights have been ignored, and over the years there's been several sort of questions asked, which have really sort of come to a head recently about Tulip Siddiq's own properties and connections to that regime. And the fact that she and some of her family in this country appear to be living in houses that were bought with proceeds from that regime, been bought by people who are part of that regime. Now, she reported herself to the ethics advisor, apparently after having been urged to do so, because she was just holding on and doing nothing about it at all. And then the ethics advisor has said, well, no, look, I completely believe Tulip Siddiq that when she visited the Kremlin years ago with her aunt as part of a Bangladeshi delegation, she was just there as a tourist. There's nothing at all. I believe everything she says about this, that, and the other, and that she didn't know who owned her houses or where the money had come from. But as Sophie's pointed out, in her role at the Treasury, she should probably have been aware that this didn't look too good, and she should perhaps have, resolved herself from some of the roles in question. But interestingly, the ethics advisor also, and you can see some images there of Tulip with Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who's one of her constituents. She spent a long time campaigning for her to be freed. So Tulip is by no means all a bad person, but she's definitely been hanging around an awful lot with someone involved in a very bad regime. Whether that was a member of your family or not, most MPs would probably put some distance between them and that regime. But the ethics advisor in this report did say, well, look, I'm not quite sure, really. He sort of said, where's the effect of the Prime Minister may wish to consider what her roles and responsibilities are in the light of all this, which is very much seems like a sort of veiled criticism of the PM for even appointing her to this job in the first place. This is old news, a lot of it. It's been known and discussed for quite a long time. The suggestion that Keir Starmer put in charge of corruption to start with is a bit odd. Steve says, whatever the ethics committee says, it all just smells bad. Well, that's the thing. It looks bad, Steve. It smells bad. It's time to go. And in fact, while there was investigations going on, while there was these suggestions, and actually in Bangladesh, where her aunt has been deposed and her political enemies are now in power, they're making a lot of these allegations. Even if the allegations are bogus and they're just being made by political enemies, you stand aside if you have ethics, don't you? And let that all blow over before you carry on. So questions are now quite reasonably being asked about Keir Starmer's judgment after this. After his own ethics advisor really questioned why she was appointed in the first place. He'll be facing questions this afternoon at PMQs in Parliament. I expect, Sophie. Now, Siddiq, as you said, is the MP for the constituency next door to his. They've always been friends. They've campaigned for each other. But is this on the same scale, do you think, as the kind of blind loyalty we saw displayed by PMs like Boris Johnson, who backed his government colleagues, even when they were fined for criminal behaviour, even when they were accused of sexual assault? He stood by them and saw no reason for them to be fined or fired or anything else. In fact, still says some of that stuff. I know that Keir said he was better than all that, but it's not quite on the same spreadsheet, is it?
It's not quite. I do think that they're opening themselves up to a great deal of public criticism by just sort of ignoring the fact that when you are a senior politician with a huge deal of power, what you really owe to your constituents and to the country at large is to make yourself kind of sort of, it's difficult to know where the line is, but you do sort of want to strive for a kind of a moral high ground that means even if you technically have done nothing wrong and you think it's unfair that you're being associated with something like this, and for the Prime Minister to show such a great degree of sort of loyalty and support to someone he probably considers, a friend and a close colleague, it still just can't come before the fact that in losing the trust and the sort of unimpeachability from your constituents, you are just sort of failing as a politician. And you do just have to put that first over your own self-interest and over the kind of the generosity and allowances that might be extended to a normal citizen. You kind of have to be above that as an MP.
Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think this looks like sleaze? Do you agree with Steve that if it just smells bad? Do you think that they've acted well and at the right time and that they're doing better than the Tories? Or do you think this is all much of a muchness? They're all sleazy. They're all in it. There's obviously quite a lot going on here, perhaps, that we don't know. I mean, do you think that they've acted wisely and well? This is a government that was elected basically after having said, look, the other lot are really sleazy. And they're corrupt, and we're going to be better than that. We're going to be professional. We're going to be grown up. We're going to have an ethics advisor, which, of course, the last government got rid of that, never found a new one, I think, through several prime ministers. And so having recruited one, they now have to abide a bit by the findings of them. Are they being more ethical? And like Sophie says, should they have to be held to a higher standard or not than there would be perhaps for you or I? If we had an aunt who happens to be a foreign despot,
we've all got one.
We would lose our jobs over it. What do you think, everyone? Of course, as you said, this is the second minister to resign in 7 months, which is not a good look. And as the Mirror's Politics newsletter points out this morning, subscribe to it if you haven't already, neither of them had done anything wrong in their jobs at all. Siddiq was cleared of wrongdoing by the ethics advisor, and the Transport Secretary, Lou Haig, resigned over an issue for which she had already sort of been quite honest about, and it happened years and years earlier. Combined with the attacks we've seen this week on the Chancellor and her competence, where does this leave Starmer's government, do you think, Sophie? As it struggles to take control of the narrative, really, and to look like it's actively improving the situation, which is what it was elected to do.
Yeah, it's really not a great time for the Treasury in general, is it? And again, I suppose that you could make the argument that in resigning in such a public way, both of these two ministers, Louise Haig and Tulip Siddiq, are kind of trying to set the example that they are different from the last Tory government, in which MPs who were accused of similar or more serious allegations just hung on and on and on and maintained that they'd done nothing wrong and they didn't need to take any particular action. It still doesn't look great, but I do wonder if that's the strategy, is by sort of being like, well, we're different than the other lot because we take accountability and we take responsibility. And when we're becoming, a distraction, which is the often sort of wheeled out phrase to explain why someone's resigning despite having done nothing wrong, that they are just sort of setting themselves apart from Tory sleaze.
If that was the case, though, she would have resigned a couple of months ago, because it was been really
make that argument.
In fact, she might have said, when Korea said, would you like to be anti-corruption czar, she might have said, you know what, I think that's going to be a bit of a sticky.
Might not be the best portfolio for me. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like if someone had said to me, would you like a job being in charge of the MOD? I'd go, no, just the MOD.
Conflict of interest, yeah.
It's probably not going to go. So it is what it is. We've had 2 ministers down in 7 months. Let's see if we can make it through till spring without another one going. I think that's where we appear to be looking at these days. If you're going to be whiter than white, then everyone's got to be whiter than white, and they've got to be proven to be that way. Otherwise, they have to fall on their sword. So there probably will be some more at some point, I would imagine. Now, on to what is going to be the story of the next half decade, and certainly was of the previous half decade, which is Donald Trump's involvement in the Capitol riots of 2020, which came about after he claimed the election he had lost was in fact stolen, and urged his supporters to fight for their country when they gathered to protest in Washington. What followed is well known, but people died in the ensuing riots and hundreds were tracked down and jailed. Of course, Trump was seen as the instigator, the inciter, the person who was ultimately responsible for just being such a bad loser that he started a riot. And yesterday, the prosecutor leading the case into the former president published his report into the evidence that he had gathered. Sophie, can you take us through it a bit? What did they find? Did they find anything at all?
So everyone will remember the January 6th riot, which is now 4 years ago, if you can believe it. I think we all sort of watched around the world with kind of open mouths at what we were seeing. And the fact that Donald Trump, who was still the president at that time, was not only sort of not condemning the actions of these people who were violently breaking into the Capitol, but was actively sort of goading them on from his social media accounts. Last July, the Supreme Court, which it should be mentioned, does have a conservative majority at the moment. They basically ruled that Trump was entitled to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for those actions. But Jack Smith, who is the special prosecutor who was appointed to investigate the alleged interference, has just concluded in a report that Trump did in fact engage in what he says was an unprecedented criminal effort to overturn the legitimate results of the election in order to retain power. But ultimately, none of that matters because of this extremely, what seems to us in the UK, bizarre quirk of the justice system in the US, which basically means that any act carried out by a president in official capacity as president under core constitutional powers, regardless of what it was, if it was, criminal action, if it led to sort of what might be described or found to have been criminal action, they can't be legally prosecuted for it. They can't face any sort of legal punishment for it, and they are given what's known as full immunity, which is sort of the very opposite of what we were just talking about with Tulip Siddiq and the idea that we have here, that MPs have to be held to a higher standard than normal people. In the States, it's sort of like if you're president, you can kind of get away with just about anything as long as you do things while you're president and you do them in your official capacity as president. You have this kind of untouchability, which seems deeply odd and undemocratic, I think, to most people, at least in this country.
Yeah, Steve says it's much the same as this country. Those with money seem to be above the law. I think I would disagree a bit there, Steve. I think, you know, in America, cash is king, and those with money can do pretty much whatever they please. And a lot of people with money in this country can get away with more than the average Joe. But as we've just seen with Tulip, once you're elected, you are held to a slightly different standard. And Trump is elected, and he was elected at the time that these riots took place. The issue, of course, as Sophie said, is that there has been a ruling which says that you can do whatever you like as president. And he was a sitting president at the time of the riots in early 2021. So there's, you know, he can't be accused of insurrection because he was already in charge, which is bizarre because he was about to not be in charge. And that was the whole reason for the insurrection. They decided they couldn't charge him with incitement because that wasn't clear enough, but they did want to charge him with this sort of criminal effort to overturn because of, you know, ringing up people in Georgia, demanding they find new votes, getting people to sign false statements and so on, so they could use that as evidence of false voting when it wasn't. Richard says, if or rather when America faces buyer's remorse, where will the swinging voter go next? Assuming Trump ends at the natural term limit, will the pro-Republican mood continue to the next back-in-timers? Who knows? But I you know, last time Trump was in office, he was talking about maybe having a third term and overthrowing the Constitution. And that would usually require an absolute majority in the Senate and Congress. But you know, lots of things that usually are the rules in America don't seem to apply to Trump, and he seems to find a way to overturn them. And what's happened here is that he has played an absolute blinder with this case, or rather his lawyers have. They have delayed and appealed at every single stage. They've added months to that investigation. They've dragged and dragged and dragged it out. It has been going on pretty much the entire 5 years. They scored that Supreme Court ruling that almost everything a president does while in office cannot later be prosecuted. They got him re-elected, which makes him untouchable. You can't jail a sitting president, or at least never happened before. And they were appealing even the release of the report until late the night before last. And it's only when they lost that it was put into the public domain. I mean, even after he was home and dry, scot-free, they still didn't want the report to come out. And the reason for that, I suspect, Sophie, is because this is going to hang around Trump's neck, isn't it, to some great extent for the next 5 years. You know, according to his own Justice Department, he is an unconvicted felon, and he's walking around Washington with his finger on the nuclear button. He's not going to ever get away from this, is he?
No, he won't. But I do wonder, in the Trump playbook, which he, you know, the last 10 years have been completely dominated by him. It looks like the next 10 years will be as well, which is, you know, a slightly exhausting proposition. What he benefits from, though, is positioning himself as an outsider and as a sort of scapegoat that, you know, the sort of, whether he's the victim of, you know, mainstream media or the rest of the US government, what he likes to do is to kind of almost play the sort of prosecuted martyr that, you know, these sort of like shadowy institutions and the rest of the government is sort of like out to get, but he's, you know, this maverick who just sort of gets away with things because, you know, he's such a brave truth teller, I suppose. Again, this is the sort of rhetoric that
like billionaire for whom the world
I know. I know.
Recently, they're having a dreadful time.
They really are. They really can't catch a break, those guys. And so I do wonder whether he'll be able to play this to his advantage. He has already put out some top quality classic Trump content on Truth Social, which is the social media platform that he moved to after Twitter, in which he called the special prosecutor deranged. He's once again said that he's working for crooked Joe Biden. He's got a couple of new phrases that he seems to have come up with. He's calling them the unselect committee of political hacks and thugs. He's also said Jack Smith is a lame brain prosecutor and ends it in all caps saying the voters have spoken, 3 exclamation marks. Yeah. And so he seems to be very much leaning into that narrative that this is a total witch hunt. He's used that phrase, totally innocent, again, which he always likes to trot out. And to be honest, I don't really think his supporters won't care, obviously, and he's got such a decent and kind of strong, if not majority, a decent portion of the American voter base on side, as the 2024 election did prove when he won the popular vote and the Electoral College quite comfortably. And I do also wonder if people who don't support him are so sort of run down and exhausted and sort of jaded by his total ability to just sort of like skate past things and get away with things that no one else would seem to be able to do, that maybe the wind has sort of been taken out of their sails a bit, and they maybe just won't be able to sort of drum up as much justified moral outrage over this as they might have been able to in 2016 or 2020. As I said before, it feels like Trump has totally dominated not just US, but Western and arguably global politics since 2015, which is now 10 years ago. He's going to be president until 2029. Maths.
At least.
So he is looking set to sort of continue that dominance.
Exactly. And Jake on Twitter says, Joe Biden, on the other hand, has equipped, financed and protected the genocide that has slaughtered tens of thousands of civilians. What are the prospects of him being locked up? Justice A. The difference is that arming Israel is not a crime. Whereas the stuff that Trump was found to have done, according to Jack Smith, they found evidence enough to charge him and to hold a conviction as well, to get a conviction and to make that conviction safe. They found enough to actually lock him up. Consistently right on Twitter, possibly not their right name, says this is all a bunch of crap, legal media and liberal scam. See, there are lots of people buying into that Trump narrative that this is all part of what's out to get him. What do you think, everybody? Do you think that it's absolutely fine for Trump to have got through this and to not be held accountable and to not be on trial and to be taking the White House? He has, after all, been elected by a significant number of people in America who plainly don't give too much of a damn about it. When Trump takes office next week, he's already said he's going to pardon many of the Capitol rioters. Some, of course, did just get swept up and didn't do anything violent, but others were far more culpable. And indeed, there are still some investigations into people who are connected to Trump and their involvement in illegal behavior. And those prosecutions could still go ahead and still perhaps even potentially call Trump as a witness. And still rumble on over the next 5 years. But Trump will be imposing his own pick on the Justice Department. They will try to squash any further looking at this, you would have thought. But is it going to go away? Although he could play this, Sophie, according to his own rules, there might be private prosecutions brought by victims or relatives. There could be constant picking over it by Democrats, by committees. There'll be midterm elections as well, which could be affected by it. People using the fact, really, that Trump had some degree of involvement, to destabilize and decredit whatever he does in office. There's a risk that, and also, even if he does what you've suggested there and use that Trump playbook, he's really doing that about something that happened 5 years previous, over and over and over and over again. And that's not a good look for any sitting politician. They need to be talking about the future and what they're doing right now today. If the narrative is all about what happened in the past, as Tulip Siddiq found out, eventually you have to fall on your sword.
That's true, although a lot of, obviously, Trump's rhetoric is very backwards looking and a sort of desire to return to some sort of fabled American heartland utopia. So it is sort of just in keeping in character for him to be sort of obsessed with something that now happened quite a long time ago, and to keep returning to that as a sort of way to score points and make himself again look like this sort of persecuted martyr, almost kind of a Christ-like figure for his supporters. So I suppose it's hardly surprising that he's so hung up on this. He does seem to be in possession of an alarmingly delicate ego, and is certainly known to kind of hold grudges against people he thinks who have wronged him for years, if not decades. So I suppose it's hardly a surprise, but you're right that it's not a great look, and it's hardly inspiring rhetoric from the next president of the United States.
No, and it'll be interesting to see perhaps as well how Keir Starmer's relationship with him pans out over the next 5 years. And what on earth Trump would have to say about something like tulips. Oh gosh. Anyway, if only we were all white billionaires, we could all have such thin skins and such determination to escape the consequences of our actions. Right, we have managed to find some good news in the world for you, and here it is. Now, there's only one bit of good news in town today, and it is, of course, the fact that Princess of Wales is in remission from the cancer that she spent more than a year being treated for. But even more importantly is that, as we can see there in the Mirror today, she's using that experience to highlight that of others, all those at the Marsden who are still undergoing treatment. She spoke to them yesterday about how their families need looking after as much as the patient does, the trials, tribulations of treatment, and not only that, of course, and the brilliance of the staff who help look after her and her family, but as one of those patients pointed out, they made them feel like they were the most special people in the room, and highlighted an awful lot of things which perhaps most people, when they think about cancer, and certainly about the royal family and their experience of cancer at the moment, perhaps haven't thought about. Sophie, is this proof that, do you think, while politicians with a very important job to do often let us down, sometimes it's those out of work whose good deeds can have a bigger impact on our lives?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's the sense that obviously Kate Middleton is just an exceptionally good people person. She's always just able to connect with people and communicate on their level in a way that I think makes them sort of forget that she is, the future Queen of England and lives a lifestyle that is entirely incompatible with their own. But what she is doing here really well is sort of using her own, obviously really, really tough experience of the last year or two, and using that to kind of shed light on the people who are actively undergoing really, really tough treatment for cancer. She went during a full session in which people were receiving treatments, which can be very sort of painful, physically taxing, exhausting. And she was chatting to them, kind of letting them know how she had gotten through it. Peter Burton, who spoke to the Mirror after her visit, said that she was really, really personable, really inspiring. And I do think that, it was a really nice, it's a nice story, isn't it? It's nice to see people able to relate to others in that way.
Exactly. Yeah. And she was talking as well about the port, the connector that she had sort of attached to her for her chemotherapy treatment, and how she, was attached to it for a long time. She got quite used to it, and she missed it when it had gone. Things like that. It just makes the royal family seem a bit more human, but also I think it makes those people in the Royal Marsden feel a little bit more special and noticed and seen. And she can use the spotlight on her, put the spotlight on them, which is a jolly nice thing to do, especially when someone, like I said, doesn't really have a job, doesn't really have a role that's defined, but has plainly decided to do something useful with it. That's nice, isn't it? It's a nice tone to end on. Right, thank you very much, Sophie, for taking us through that. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. Prime Minister's Questions will be back on these channels at 12 o'clock today. If you'd like to hear more about Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves and Tulip Siddiq, or if you'd rather tune out, I think we'd all understand. We'll be back again on Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. But until then, everybody, stay safe, take care. Tatty bye.